That was a section from my piece Beneath Arches of Sublime Wonder for flute and pre-recorded sounds. I've come to look at the sublime wonders around the north end of Weimar, most of which are relatively new. They've been built since the classical era. This is the Weimar Bahnhof, the train station, built in 1846. The neoclassical lobby hall was added during the Weimar Republic, when Weimar was the capital of Thuringia. Unfortunately, the station and the city has been omitted from the new long-distance services, but I suppose that means the building will remain in its current state for a while to come. In this episode, I want to look at the topical matter of relativism and how it pertains to different areas of knowledge. Given that the cultural relativism espoused by Herder and the historical relativism introduced by Hegel are both enshrined in postmodernist pluralism, and given the controversy that such notions have generated, there's reason to explore the entire issue. I shall begin with the consideration of how relativism pertains to normative values, and then look at matters of empirical underdeterminism and epistemic relativism. I'll briefly consider the problems associated with justifying pluralist and postmodernist epistemics before introducing the notion of Alethic relativism as a means to address these problems. Indeed, any theory pertaining to relativism must encompass a historical narrative of the many clashes between seemingly incompatible epistemic systems over the centuries, such as that between social classes in Baroque Europe, or between European settlers and indigenous peoples in Africa, the Americas, Australasia and elsewhere. Beliefs and values about land use and ownership, social hierarchies and community responsibilities look to different systems of belief, justification, knowledge and truth, each of which in turn assumed a relativist grounding, contradicting its own assumed absolutism. Relativism is most frequently advocated in society in terms of normative values. One person's good is another person's bad. One person's belief in truth A is relative to and justified by paradigm X, while another person's belief in truth B is relative to and justified by paradigm Y. Truths A and B may be incompatible, yet they're both justified by their respective paradigms, which are themselves self-justifying. One person likes classic rock, and another person likes heavy metal, each relative to their particular tastes, which I suppose, as Schiller would claim, are derived at least in part from their respective cultural backgrounds. One subculture listens to opera, derived from a Baroque aristocratic heritage, while another subculture listens to musicals, derived from a popularist heritage, each countenanced by cultural convention and, to some extent, successful marketing strategies. This is not necessarily a moral issue, not in itself, but it illustrates the links between matters of relative opinion and those of justification. One society considers slurping noodles as a sign of appreciation and good taste. I'm referring to Japan, where I lived for 7 years. And another considers slurping as ill-mannered and vulgar. Each sentiment relative to cultural norms. One culture believes in religion A, while another culture believes in religion B, each relative to and justified by its respective divine revelation. This is the Neues Museum Weimar, originally built in 1869 as the Grand Ducal Museum, one of the first museums in all of Germany. It was damaged in the war, but reopened in the European City of Culture year, 1999. It frequently hosts special exhibitions, including works from the collection of Paul Meintz. Relativism is easy to grasp when it comes to normative values and art galleries, but as I've said before, it becomes more difficult when it comes to science and empirical knowledge. After all, according to the orthodox paradigm, natural science is derived from objectivity and impartiality. The chemical formula for water, H2O, is the same whatever the cultural context and whatever a people's beliefs. Of course, a case can be made out that science practice is made biased by various social, political and economic factors, which, for instance, might shape the development of technology and knowledge according to certain values. Furthermore, when it comes to theorizing, a best fit approach is never going to be entirely neutral. Again, as I've said before, in many research contexts, including those of physics, available data can invariably be used to fit a range of different theories. When one theory becomes more popular than another among experts, despite the lack of justification, explanations point to the sociological dimension. This is the issue of conventionalism that I discussed at the Bach Wall in episode 17. Willard Quine at Harvard University pointed out that while the ancient Greek belief in Olympian gods and goddesses is today considered false belief, and belief in electromagnetic waves is considered true warranted belief, both are unobservable phenomena and, as such, are equally justifiable as regards their ability to explain raw observations. Quine's paper, Two Dogmas of Empiricism, argued that circumstances of underdeterminism entail that scientists can always justify a wide range of theory. He said, "Any statement can be held true what may, if we make drastic enough adjustments elsewhere in the system. Both sorts of entities enter our conceptions only as cultural posits." This is no longer a matter pertaining only to science practice. This principle has been used to question the efficacy of all knowledge based upon observed evidence, even extending to the periodic table. For instance, confirmation hallism argues that all theories, and accordingly all propositions derived from them, including the chemical constructs of water, can never be proved as certain by empirical data. Knowledge will always be subject to revision and consequently must be considered fallible. According to the Austrian Paul Feyerabend at UC Berkeley, all science knowledge should be considered not as impartial but as relative. He believed that privileging one conception of truth or rationality or scientific knowledge in the name of a supposed objectivity runs the risk of imposing a repressive worldview on other cultural groups with different paradigms pertaining to the nature of existence and the intellectual frameworks used to justify matters. He pleaded for intellectual and political tolerance and an end to dogma in science and politics. He argued in his Democratic Relativism, according to John Preston, that as long as we use only one empirical adequate theory, we'll be unable to imagine alternative accounts of reality. If we also accept the positivist view that our theories are summaries of experience, those theories will be void of empirical content and untestable, and hence there will be a diminution in the critical, argumentative function of our language. Just as purely transcendent metaphysical theories are unfalsifiable, so too what began as an all-embracing scientific theory offering certainty will, under these circumstances, have become an irrefutable dogma, a myth. Besides those who've looked at matters of practice and methodology to question the supposed impartiality of would-be objective knowledge, others have further developed considerations of epistemology and, in particular, how the identification of rules for guiding the acquirement of beliefs and knowledge and understanding is affected by epistemic norms. Epistemic relativism posits that no human knowledge can ever be neutral. It must, by definition, exist within the boundaries of its own historical, cultural and conceptual framework, and is given truth values only relative to this framework. If I perceive a tree as a tree, then it's because I have a mental concept of that tree in my mind, and those mental concepts are affected by linguistic and semantic issues, as well as cultural biases. A tree is something very different if I need to use it for firewood than if I have the opportunity to appreciate it aesthetically. Furthermore, if I say that an actual tree is a totality of all the facts pertaining to that tree, including its function in the ecosphere, as well as in the world of humans, and including its biological, cellular and molecular processes, and including the every movement of every particle comprising the tree and its interactions with every other particle in the universe, then it's clear that no individual person can entertain all the possible observable facts. And if a person knows only some of the facts, then his or her knowledge of the tree is not neutral. It's relative to the particular facts known. It must, by definition, be a subjective perspective. Even if my perspective is scientific, and I'm an expert on cellular photosynthesis, then still my perspective is constrained by epistemic norms, and is not impartial. Similarly, the modern conception of water as H2O is shaped by contemporary understanding of chemistry. Yet this knowledge is relative to a historical and technological context. Understanding of molecular structure used to be different, and no doubt it will change again, or advance, depending on the theoretical paradigm, as the quarks embedded in protons and neutrons reveal more of their properties. The fascinating building behind me is a Weimar Amtsgericht, the court offices. It was originally constructed as a youth detention centre 100 years ago and continued to be used for this purpose until only a decade ago. The cells were used again last year as a gallery for the Kunstfest, the Summer Arts Festival. It's as good a place as any to testify a summary of things. A pluralist approach to norms of belief, based on the relativity of all knowledge, acknowledges the multiplicity of standards pertaining to justification, any one combination of which might be used to arrive at any particular belief. Two individuals may observe the same event and interpret it very differently, which in turn causes them to have very different beliefs about the event, and accordingly, all other events thereafter. However, this seems to point to a vicious regress. It's not only the perception of and rationalization of events at the core of the difference of opinion. The consequence of this multiplicity of epistemics is that there can be no confirmation that the individuals have actually observed the same event. Indeed, a pluralist approach, based on the tenets of epistemic relativism, undermines the possibility of shared knowledge altogether. It's been suggested by foundationalists that the best solution to all of these regresses is a foundational justification of knowledge by way of the individual. So, as regards perception, if perceptually it seems that a certain thing is true, then, on the face of it, the individual is rationally permitted to believe that the certain thing is true. It's the same with shared knowledge, such as the spoken words of another person. If someone testifies that a certain thing is true, then prima facie, unless there are defeaters suggesting otherwise, the individual is rationally permitted to believe that the certain thing is true. As regards reasoning by induction, if a particular sequence of events has been observed, and furthermore there's an apparent pattern in the sequence, then prima facie, the individual is rationally permitted to believe in the predictability of that sequence. As regards reasoning by deduction, if there's reason to believe that a certain proposition is true, and also that the truth of that proposition necessarily implies the truth of a second proposition, then, prima facie, the individual is rationally permitted to believe the second proposition. All of these functions depend upon, by and large, an intuitive and psychological form of propositional logic, which in turn relies upon the privileging of coherence and the principle of non-contradiction. In other words, it has to make sense to the individual. But this is not the easy solution it might seem. Epistemic relativism, like all kinds of relativism, remains subject to being undermined by the fact it cannot be stated without contradicting itself. If relativity is dependent upon the individual's perspective, then that perspective is also relative to itself, which is solipsism. This is asymmetrical, as one person's solipsism is refuted by the next person's solipsism. Either that, or it's democratic and a vicious infinite regress which prevents anybody from saying anything. Indeed, any statement of relativism refutes relativism. That there are no universal truths cannot avoid presenting itself as a universal truth. The statement "truth is relative" means it is an absolute truth that truth is relative, which is a contradiction in terms. Similarly, the relative truth that truth is relative would allow for absolutism. Furthermore, in further opposition to foundationalism, most psychology theory agrees with Kant and argues that both perception and rationalism rely upon individualized forms of psychological reasoning and intuitive types of logic and probabilities, all of which are often inconsistent with any kind of formal logic. They're spontaneous and, by and large, outside the conscious control of the individual, which means they do not allow for normative judgment at all. So, if presumed absolute knowledge is relative to the individual, which is incoherent in terms of that individual's presumed absolute standards, which in turn are incoherent, and the role of any epistemic system is to define normative facts, which traditionally would have been seen as objective facts, then pluralist epistemics implies there can be no absolute normative facts, only facts associated with different conceptual schemes, which in turn are incoherent by their own absolute standards, another regress. But there is a possible solution. The theory of factual relativity refutes the realist position that it's even necessary to confirm that two individuals have observed the same event, that there is in fact a singular event. Adopting an anti-realist position, it rejects the notion that knowledge is independent of thought or context. Any particular object or event is taken to be connected with any second object in a relativistic manner by way of a variable frame of reference, which itself entails the impossibility of empirical knowledge attaining universality, and, accordingly, objectivity. The theory advocates the notion of meaning variance, whereby the scientific definitions of objects and events that characterize shared knowledge are not fixed but subject to change. Physics says the mass of a body is the same wherever it is in the universe, yet, concurrently, the theory of factual relativity argues that there can be no absolute facts about mass and simultaneity, only relational facts. Time is relative, and thus even the simultaneity of simultaneous events exists in a relative way. There is no absolute frame of reference. The theory has been expressed in many forms, but always the ultimate target has been the implied epistemic monism of natural science. Many postmodernists, feminist epistemologists, and sociologists of science, for example, have all argued for one form of factual relativism or another. Postmodernists, such as Derrida and Foucault, have argued that the very tools employed by science methodology, such as reason, logic and rationality, make only pretense at coherence while acting as instruments of political and cultural domination. They endorse the principle of factual relativity even as they reject the norms of objectivity, truth and reason as an imposition of political power. Neutrality is considered a political ideology, although in this case, so is a relativity that opposes it. In support of factual relativity, and also in response to the argument that there can be no coherent absolutism and no coherent relativism, Alethic relativism, incorporating the possible world semantics developed by Kripke, points out that both absolutism and relativity themselves refer to an external modal condition. In the case of the first, absolutism refers to itself, its necessity, which is its absolutism, while in the case of the latter, the relative position refers to a coherent system of possible worlds that is itself relative. Both conditions, rather than being absolute or relative in themselves, are conditions of their own truth. Alethic relativism states that truth itself is both absolute and relative, encompassing the necessary and the contingent, and consequently that any statement of truth can be both absolute and relative to a frame of reference accessible beyond that absolutism. I'll spend much of the remaining episodes of this inquiry looking at possible world semantics. I need to explore further what it means to say the relativist absolutism of truth points to the notion of a relativist ontology, whereby water is H2O is both a necessary and objective truth, and yet also, by way of its inaccessibility to all possible worlds, dependent on perspective. I need to know what this means for moral and aesthetic judgments pertaining to educational and music matters. But for now, I'll finish with another section from my piece for flute and pre-recorded sounds, Beneath Arches of Sublime Wonder. The music carries the flutist on a journey in pursuit of truth, confronting various incidents and obstacles that present contradictions and paradox, until at the end, as with Iphigenia, there's the ultimate simultaneity, which in turn is a reflection of the journey. Thanks for listening.